Finally speaking up about the king of rock and roll is 74-year-old Kurt Russell. What he stated astonished his buddies. For decades, Russell's name has been associated with Elvis Presley. And not just because he did a fantastic job portraying the star in the 1979 biopic. The link dates back to Russell's early years. Elvis was always considered a star by the majority of Hollywood folks. But Kurt saw something else. A man caught between two worlds caught his attention. Even though he was loved by millions, he felt haunted when the lights went dark. Until recently, Russell had kept that to himself. He was not going to exploit them. Despite the fact that numerous people have heard Elvis's story over and over, Russell is prepared to speak the truth about Elvis the man, Elvis the character, and Elvis in a way that no one else has ever done before at this stage of his life. I will always remember what he says because it breaks my heart. A tale he alone could tell. On the streets of Hollywood in 1963, Elvis Presley ran into a teenage Kurt Russell. Russell was just another young performer aspiring to stardom in Hollywood. The film was called It Happened at the World's Fair. With Elvis at the top of his game, it was a humorous one. Although Russell had a minor role, it was noteworthy. He was the young man who was paid to approach Elvis and give him a shin kick. Despite being a brief, humorous moment, it marked the beginning of a lifelong connection for Kurt. However, the way Elvis spoke to the youngster after the scene ended was not captured on video. Unlike some celebrities, Elvis wasn't aloof or impolite to young actors. Instead, he was friendly, jovial, and warm. Russell has spoken in recent years about how he recalled how Elvis would greet him with a grin, speak to him as if he were a friend, and ensure that he didn't feel afraid while working. For a 12-year-old boy, that meant the world. Russell had his first genuine taste of what it may be like to be famous. It's a reality, not just a dream. He had witnessed firsthand how Elvis walked, how he attracted attention, and how the atmosphere swiftly shifted once the cameras stopped. Even in those days, people could see loneliness in Elvis's eyes. Everyone else seems unable to cope with the burden of being Elvis Presley. That brief meeting left Kurt profoundly impacted, and as he grew older, he was unable to shake it. For Kurt Russell, it was a memorable moment from his early years that would resurface years later when fate called again. But for most others, it was just a humorous movie scene. Many years later, Kurt found out that he was one of the few actors still living who had actually worked with the king when he was approached to play him in a TV biography. He'd seen and touched Elvis up close, aside from that, had witnessed the fragility and beauty that most others could only speculate about. That one shin kick turned into a warning. It was brief, easy, and enjoyable. However, it permanently connected Russell to Elvis. Kurt's life and the responsibilities he would bear for decades would be shaped by the little act he committed at the time. Kurt Russell had grown into a young man by the late 1970s and was steadily expanding his company. However, nothing could have prepared him for the moment that would eventually alter how everyone perceived him. Just 2 years after Elvis's untimely death in 1977, television producers sought to portray his narrative in a genuine, unvarnished, and honest manner. It will not be that easy. People had conflicting opinions on Elvis, who was both a tragic figure in his final years and a magnificent celebrity in the 1950s, and millions of his followers were still depressed. Kurt Russell was the only actor who could truly embody the King's personality when casting for the 1979 TV biography Elvis Began. The stakes were high from the beginning. This was not only a component, it was a cultural occasion. There was the King's family. Fans were present. Everyone was watching them. The burden was too great for Russell to handle. He knew that failure would harm more than just his career. He would disrespect the most popular entertainer in American history. Even those closest to Russell were taken aback by the amount of effort he put into getting ready. He spent hours observing Elvis's gait, picking up on the small head tilts and the motions of his hands while he held a microphone. He put a lot of effort into perfecting the southern drawl so that Elvis's voice could be heard in every syllable. Russell, however, was aware that he needed to learn more than just the ways of Elvis Presley. He needed to demonstrate Elvis Presley's humanity. Being a stereotype didn't appeal to him. He intended to behave like a man. According to friends, Russell was so engrossed in the role that he nearly succumbed to it. In addition to learning the techniques, he would spend hours watching old recordings of Elvis to try to understand his emotions at the time by looking into his eyes. Russell put forth a lot of effort, and it paid off in unexpected ways. When the film was released in 1979, people were taken aback. Many Elvis admirers claimed that it was the first time they had ever seen him as more than simply a fictional character. Russell's performance was described by numerous reviewers as forceful, eerie, and peculiar. Even if it was only for a few hours, some individuals claimed that it felt like Elvis was alive once more. Many insiders continue to claim that no one has ever performed anything like Russell, not even in later roles portrayed by more well-known Hollywood actors. In addition to making him a well-known actor, the role accomplished something more profound. It connected him to Elvis in a way that transcended Hollywood. Russell was more than a mere actor posing as someone else. He was utilized by millions of fans to enjoy his life, remember the monarch, and express their sorrow. That tie would always be a part of him, altering both his perception of himself and how others saw him. Although it was the most significant position Russell would ever have, it also served as a reminder to him of his obligation to pay tribute to a man whose life was both tragic and wonderful. Long before the cameras began rolling, Kurt Russell's work on the 1979 Elvis film became deeply personal. The majority of individuals were unaware of this. The project had a sacred quality because Elvis Presley wasn't just another well-known figure whose life could be dramatized for television ratings. Many fans all around the world were still harmed by him. Because Elvis had just been dead for 2 years, people were still tremendously depressed. They were aware that for the film to be entirely authentic, the Presley family had to approve it. That blessing was indeed offered by Elvis Presley's father, Vernon Presley, and it was not delivered carelessly. Vernon Presley noticed more than just a talented actor in Kurt Russell. In 1963, he ran into someone who had somehow known his son, even if briefly. That human connection was crucial. Vernon was certain that Russell would not mock Elvis or minimize him to a collection of ostentatious stage tricks and extravagant eccentricities. He believed Kurt could portray Elvis as the genuine guy, the son he knew who was the source of his notoriety. That responsibility weighed heavily on Russell. He did it for more reasons than just getting paid to act. He held the memory of a guy whose image meant the world to an entire generation, as well as the dreams of a father who had lost his son. The actual shoot was challenging. The days were lengthy, and Russell had never experienced such intense emotion. There were moments on set when the part's weight was nearly frightening. Russell claimed in subsequent interviews that he believed Elvis was guiding, observing, and occasionally haunting his performance. Some crew members even described their transformation as unsettling. Russell, it was as if the king himself had returned after donning the costume and speaking in Elvis's voice. However, there was a cost to this unsettling truth. When Russell returned home, he would be exhausted, both physically and mentally. He had no narrative to tell. A life that would end in catastrophe was what he was starting. Furthermore, the more he immersed himself in it, the more pronounced the specters of Elvis's troubles become. Russell never imagined feeling so alone, so vulnerable, and so torn between joy and sorrow. He experienced all of these things in unexpected ways. There were moments when it was bright, despite the wait. Russell discussed his desire to demonstrate the joy that Elvis brought to people, the intensity of his performances, and his magnetism. He wanted the film to be more than just a depressing film. He wanted it to be a party as well. The most difficult thing he had to accomplish at work was to balance those two things, but it was also the most fulfilling. When I eventually managed to get Vernon Presley to see Russell's performance, he started crying. For the first time, he told his friends and family, he believed that the world could now see Elvis not just as a celebrity, but also as the man he had reared. That was Kurt Russell's last piece of evidence. Kurt Russell's remarkable portrayal of Elvis was the only thing that most people saw on screen. They were unaware of the number of personal testimonies and anecdotes that were provided to him for the film. To prepare for the role, Russell spoke with members of Elvis's closest circle and relatives, as well as those who had visited Graceland when it was off limits. He heard music from friends who had witnessed the inner turmoil of fame, security who had witnessed the monarch at his most vulnerable, and musicians who had performed with him. For years, Russell pondered what he had heard, and he has only now begun to discuss how upsetting and depressing those recollections were at the age of 74. These were not the thrilling tales of fan-screamed concerts. Despite having everything, that man frequently felt as though he lacked anything. Despite his charisma, Russell saw that Elvis genuinely wanted things to remain normal. As he went along the street, he was being followed. Sitting in a diner without being surrounded by cameras was something he desired. He didn't want his roles as a spouse, father, and friend to interfere with his kingly duties. Late at night, Russell overheard intimate conversations concerning Elvis's troubles. He had too much energy to expend, so he was pacing Graceland. His body was exhausted, and his mind was racing. Rumor had it that he struggled with prescription medicines and began taking them because he was stressed and exhausted, not because he was intoxicated. The fact that Elvis had to perform so frequently, even while ill, due to the fame machine astounded Russell. His family, his co-workers, his loved ones, and the company that wouldn't let him sleep all pushed him in different directions, in ways that most people didn't believe feasible. Russell heard stories about Elvis that gave him a more authentic feel. According to his friends, Elvis would play with his daughter Lisa Marie for hours on end, laughing like any other father. Musicians praised Elvis's kindness. They claimed that he would purchase homes and cars for those he loved, and occasionally he would do it for people he hardly knew merely to cheer them up. The man behind the news and the celebrity, Russell realized, was a man whose greatest talent was not music, but his heart. Nevertheless, despite his kindness, Elvis was frequently alone. Russell has since stated that these anecdotes caused him to feel conflicted. He was saddened by the misery Elvis carried, but he also appreciated his kindness. When Kurt played the role on screen, he did more than just practice his voice and posture to seem like Elvis. It has to do with carrying these memories with him and allowing them to influence his performance as king. Furthermore, people only witnessed the most recent performance, but Russell understood that he was offering them more than just a persona. He was giving them tidbits of truth that Elvis never had the opportunity to publicly express. People were blown away by the Elvis film when it was ultimately released in 1979. Kurt Russell rose to fame by shocking the critics. However, the majority of people were unaware of the film's backstage significance and how Hollywood covertly concealed Russell's transformation tale from the public. Field workers were aware that Russell had accomplished more than merely playing. While everyone else was still depressed, he had to carry Elvis's photo with him everywhere, and he did it with such fervor that it was difficult to distinguish him from the subject. Producers, agents, and even other performers could see that Russell had invested himself in the role. When the cameras stopped rolling, he couldn't simply put it back. Behind all the applause and cheers, Kurt Russell had undergone a permanent transformation, and no one knew this better than Hollywood. Unlike many actors, Russell did not profit from such well-known roles. He hardly ever discussed in public how hard he trained, the anecdotes he heard from Elvis's closest friends, or how the role affected him. While others wrote books, conducted interviews, and profited off Elvis's notoriety, Russell took a back seat. He wasn't silent because he didn't give a damn. It was a privilege. He kept such sentiments to himself since he didn't want to exploit Elvis's story for his own benefit. Over the years, Hollywood has produced fresh Elvis-related films and documentaries, but Russell's performance has consistently been the norm. Despite the fact that numerous actors performed the role, Kurt Russell was deemed the best by both critics and fans. He had captured Elvis's essence, which is more difficult to discover, in addition to his acting prowess. However, Russell wasn't too thrilled with the recognition. The part seemed sacrosanct to him. When Russell remained silent regarding Elvis Presley's personal issues and refused to discuss them for his own benefit, his connection with the king became even more enigmatic. It was not until he was in his 70s that he began to pull back the veil. He went on to acknowledge the weight of that responsibility and the profound impact Elvis had on him. For many years, Hollywood concealed this fact from the general public. The tale of Kurt Russell's greatness as Elvis stood alone, although they did quietly acknowledge that Russell had continued to live with Presley's ghost long after the cameras had stopped rolling. It was believed at the time to be either too strong, too painful, or both to tell. Russell had been silent for a while, but now that time has passed. He is finally voicing his opinions, and there's more to the reality than everyone realized. Kurt Russell never truly left the king's shadow, despite the fact that his career took off after Elvis. Russell later starred in a number of popular films and cult favorites, such as Tombstone and Backdraft: The Thing, and Escape from New York. However, media and fans kept bringing him back to 1979. Elvis was constantly the subject of the questions. How was he prepared? What did Elvis actually look like? Has he changed since becoming king? Russell never found simple solutions. For Elvis was more than just a character he performed on stage. It pervaded every aspect of his life. including his relationships with his family and his thoughts on celebrity in general. Russell later claimed that he had an odd feeling about the price of fame after playing Elvis. He had read about Elvis's life and experienced it in his own body, so he knew what success could do. Even though it was only a profession, he felt cherished when he played that role, but he also experienced the heavy weight of expectations, the isolation of being scrutinized, and the loss of normalcy that accompanies being viewed as enormous by everyone. Knowing this had an impact on the choices he made at work. Russell avoided the accoutrements of tabloid culture, in contrast to many stars of his age. Because of how long they were together and how private their lives were, he and his longtime partner Goldie Hawn rose to fame. They didn't want Hollywood telling them how to live, so they spent much of their time raising their family out of the spotlight. According to Russell, in many respects, this was an unadulterated lesson from Elvis. He had witnessed the heartbreaking effects of the King's isolation, constant surveillance, and inability to lead a regular life. He didn't want to repeat the same error. Russell thereby maintained a clear separation between his personal and professional lives, despite becoming a Hollywood star on his own. Nevertheless, the Elvis connection was pervasive. His performance was the most realistic they had ever seen, according to fans who continued to discuss the biopic with him. Those in charge of casting frequently discussed the role as more than just a success. They considered it as a pivotal moment that demonstrated Russell's depth and charisma to carry a film. There were small references to him in films that had nothing to do with him, such as his role in Forrest Gump, in which his voice was dubbed over that of a young actor portraying Elvis. Hollywood didn't seem to want to separate the two men. Russell didn't completely embrace it, but he also didn't flee from it. He carried it quietly and respectfully, allowing Elvis's shadow to emerge without allowing it to overwhelm him. Nevertheless, the King's tale remained with him forever, as he has stated in subsequent years. It made him realize how fleeting celebrity is, how harmful excess can be, and how isolating stardom can be. We learned how to live and how not to live from Elvis's life. Kurt Russell, unlike most, had lived near enough to that flame to recall its intensity. At the age of 74, Kurt Russell finally revealed the truth about something he had concealed for decades. It's also not the glossy, ostentatious tale that fans might anticipate. Such frank, poignant, and courteous lines could only be written by someone who lived close enough to the fire to feel its heat, but far enough away to see its shadows. According to Russell, the happiest and most lonely person he had ever encountered was Elvis Presley. The King's entire life was explained by this contradiction. On stage, Elvis was larger than life. With a single grin, note, or hip sway, he could electrify an audience. The clamor of the crowd was thunderous. In contrast to the silence Elvis experienced when the stage lights went off, Russell now claims that the thunder was considerably louder. Behind closed doors, he desired something more straightforward and authentic. He wanted tranquility without cameras, love without demands, and companionship without rules. According to Russell, when he examined Elvis's life, including his public persona as well as the recollections of those who loved him, he discovered that the King had a remarkable ability to predict the future. It was almost as if Elvis knew that he would not live to old age. Russell claims that he spoke extensively about wanting to be remembered for both his good and terrible deeds, leaving a legacy, and creating music that would endure. According to Russell, the conversations revealed the most obvious indication that Elvis was carrying the burden of prophecy. He was destined to die too young and live eternally. Though they were constantly there, Elvis's anecdotes about drugs and fatigue didn't have the biggest impact on Russell. The melancholy in his eyes was the most striking thing to him. He was informed that Elvis could appear utterly alone, isolated from everyone, including his closest friends and family, even in a room full of people laughing. Additionally, he used this Elvis Russell while filming the film. He finally discusses this Elvis today. Not the Vegas stages and jumpsuit stereotype, but the genuine man behind the myth, the kind, humorous, and compassionate individual who was burdened by loneliness. Since he couldn't shake the sensation that he had spent his final days with Elvis, Russell acknowledges that impersonating the singer left him scarred for years. He recalled repeatedly watching old tapes and interviews and gazing into Elvis's eyes until it seemed as though he was peering directly into the soul of a guy who was pleading for assistance. When the film rolled, Russell did more than just play the part. He was reliving those moments, experiencing the anguish, joy, and inevitable decline. Russell has finally spoken his thoughts regarding Elvis. He believes that the crimes that surrounding him and the manner of his death shouldn't be remembered. Rather, he believes that people ought to remember his life, his music, his generosity, and his heart that gave until it was empty. He insists that Elvis was more than just the king of rock and roll. He contributed more of himself to the world than most individuals would ever give. And it is the proper way to remember him. According to Russell, speaking this truth entails more than only admitting guilt. The end is near. He doesn't feel compelled to maintain Elvis's reputation by omitting anything after decades of silence. Instead, he honors it by speaking the truth as he perceived it. Elvis wore his cap because everyone else did, even though it was too heavy for anyone to carry. He sacrificed everything he owned in order to complete the task. Kurt Russell, who is 74 years old, believes that the story he eventually shares about Elvis Presley is not only about the king's ascent and decline, but also about how two lives that were fated and age different were inextricably linked. For Russell, his bond with Elvis was more than a memory or a piece of his early life. Like a shadow over his work, or a master whose teachings endured after his passing, he was never truly gone. Kurt now realizes that his career in Hollywood was greatly influenced by the spirit of Elvis Presley. His determination on doing things his own way, his delicate balancing act between fame and solitude, and his refusal to allow the business to overshadow his family life were all influenced by the ghost of Elvis Presley. He understood the damage that unbridled affection, unrelenting pressure, and a lack of freedom could do to a man. Being great frequently meant sacrificing peace, and he vowed to himself that he would not allow that to happen to him. That commitment, which Russell never set out, was his silent gift to the king. He preserved Elvis's memory by leading a different life and demonstrating that it was possible to be well-liked and free, respected and unbroken, rather than by continuously copying him or reciting his story. Russell's art may have endured for so long because of this. While many of his pals were enmeshed in the Hollywood machine, he was not. He sought to establish himself in the same manner as Elvis, but he was astute enough to spot the pitfalls. Russell's response to a recent question about why he had safeguarded Elvis's reputation for so long was, "Because he gave the world so much. I couldn't take more from him." That statement alone demonstrates how close they were. Profit was not the goal. It had nothing to do with fame. It was about respect. Russell chose to return something to Elvis when he eventually spoke. The truth as he perceived it, unaltered and unfiltered. The young man who lit up the screen, sang with passion, gave vehicles to strangers simply to make them smile, and silently prayed for the peace he couldn't have is the one he wants people to forget. Not the bloated tabloid photo of a dead celebrity. Russell claims that rather than being a tragedy, Elvis's narrative serves as a reminder that even the greatest celebrities have flaws, and that even kings have burdens that the general public is unaware of. By sharing that story, Kurt has also revealed something about himself. He didn't look his best as Wyatt Earp, Snake Plissken, or even Elvis Presley. Protecting a story's heroes until everyone was ready to recognize them was the man's responsibility. We now acknowledge both men as wonderful individuals. Kurt Russell was the person who honorably carried Elvis's spirit, and Elvis was the rock and roll king who would always live on. In more ways than one, their lives will always be intertwined. The friendship lasted for many years. One man was passionate about music, but he burnt out too quickly. The other individual lived long enough to tell stories, and did so. When taken as a whole, they demonstrate that stories never truly end. They will live on in their songs, movies, memories, and the facts that are eventually revealed when the quiet is broken.